Hello, welcome to We Are On Call podcast. This is the officially unofficial podcast of Amazon's On Call. I'm Clayton Cranford. I'm joined by Omar Martinez.
Hello, hello.
How's it going,
Good to
Omar?
be here. It's good, good. How
All
you
right.
doing?
Good. Yeah. Beautiful day. And we get to talk about episode 4.
Yeah, episode 4. So we got episode
What do
4. Scene 1 starts out, begins with a gun salute at a funeral, Officer Delgado's funeral, and they're honoring her service. They're presenting a flag and a badge. Officers are dressed in their Class A uniform, which includes the cover, long sleeve shirt, and a tie. FTO Harmon is walking away from the service, and Sergeant Lasman walks up to her and asks if she's going to Delgado's funeral or home. And she says no, she's going back to work. She had told the lieutenant she's going back to work. If you notice too on the badge, they had the black band covering the badge. That's usually done when they're mourning a police officer who's died in the line of duty. And then shortly after the funeral, Harmon and Diaz end up going to get something to eat, and Harmon takes Diaz to her favorite barbecue spot, food truck down on the beach. And so she's, sharing this spot with him, which is, kind of a big deal. And while she's down there with him eating, she thinks Diaz is getting a call from his girlfriend, and they're talking on the phone. Turns out that actually Diaz is talking to Holt, the officer who was stuck with the needle when they were searching the park. And someone came out of a tent, and he ended up getting stuck, and they had to Narcan him, and he ended up getting tested for HIV. And so Harmon asked Diaz, how's he doing? And he says he's not doing well. He's kind of having a hard time emotionally and psychologically dealing with the needle stick, even though the HIV test came back negative. And since that, he's been out IOD. And IOD means injured on duty. And so he's been out since then. And there's kind of a pause there, and there's a moment where Harmon tells Diaz, Holt, getting stuck with the needle wasn't his fault, even though he may be feeling a little bit of that since that happened. And then Diaz asks Harmon, how about your sister? Kind of switches the conversation, and what's going on with your sister? Kind of getting some background on Harmon's sister, and she says that the sister, was in law enforcement, was involved in a high speed pursuit as a police officer, and sustained a career-ending injury. And then right then they're dispatched to a domestic dispute. So on this first scene here, obviously they're giving you a little glimpse of a law enforcement funeral. And, you're kind of seeing, they've got their, what we call Class A uniform on, the long sleeve. They've got the band across the badge, which is a sign of honor and respect to the person, the officer who was killed in the line of duty. And, some agencies never experience in the line of duty death. But when you have one, it definitely has an impact on the department and the agency and the city or county. And so what do you think? You think, in your own agency, when there was in the line of duty death, and it can be from anything, it can be from gun violence, or it can be from an accident. How did that impact the agency you worked for?
Well, I worked for the Irvine Police Department, which I don't think they ever had a line of duty death. No, they didn't. I did work for the Orange County Sheriff's Department, which has been a department who's been around, I think, longer than anything other department in Southern California. It's been around forever. They used to ride horses back in the day with the first sheriff. And and so we have when you walk into just about every facility, you always walk past the portraits of those individuals in the history of the department who've died in the line of duty. We had one not that long ago in Lake Forest. He was shot and killed by a guy with an AK-47, and Brad Riches, and I never knew him. It was before my time, but I worked with a lot of people who did know him, and so that I mean, when you're working with people who are directly affected by that, kind of like in this story, yeah, it leaves an impression on you, on the department, and yeah, I think it's important to remember those individuals, because I think as an officer, you also need to remember, like, hey, I'm not invulnerable, and
Mhm.
this is very serious. I'm going When you're putting on the uniform and you're going out on patrol or whatever you're doing, you really need to be like living in the world of I could encounter a life and death situation today, every day, and kind of carry that with you, and so you have a sense of seriousness and urgency in how you're doing things. So, but yeah, it's and going to funerals in other departments, especially like LAPD and stuff. I've been to some major individuals. The former LAPD chief, when he passed, that was is it Parks? He passed away during my time of service, and it was really an amazing service, and just the history of that department and what he meant for them, and it was really it was moving, actually. What about you? Has Long Beach PD, have they had a death in line of service?
There's been a few, and I mean the one that definitely comes to mind because I was working that day was Daryl Black and Rick Delphin, and that was a when the shooting happened, there was some gang related suspects involved in that one that they ended up finding and arresting, but you know, Daryl Black ended up dying in the line of duty. He was killed in the line of duty, and then Rick Delphin sustained some injuries that impacted the rest of his career, and then eventually he did retire, and he still has to deal with those injuries today. And when I think of that particular incident, is that when you go out and do your job, when you go out and answering calls, in the back of your mind that something bad could happen, but it's one of those things where if you concentrate on it too much, you really can't function, but it's possible. And then when you experience that happening to somebody else while you're working,
Mm.
it really can jar a department. I mean, because you go around doing all these things, answering calls and helping people and responding to potentially violent incidents, and then you have an incident where it actually does you know kill somebody that you work with. That has a huge impact, and everybody feels that, especially those officers and those detectives that worked around them closely, and they got to know them really well, and then one day they're there and the next day they're not, and they're just going out there and doing their job. They're going out there helping people, knowing that there's that risk, and yet they go out and do it anyway. And it really kind of brings that into focus, is that you're going out there doing things to help people and doing the job, but at the same time there is that risk that's there, and it's something you don't forget, and it's always there in the back of your mind. You got to have to push it back a little bit to function and do your job.
Yeah, true.
So yeah, so they that there was a definitely a service there, and then after the service, Harmon goes back to work. Um, the next uh, the next part they show is where you see Harmon taking Diaz to her favorite eatery, and it looks like it's a food truck down on the beach. And that was probably a spot she hadn't taken him to. Usually everybody has a spot or two that is their favorite place to eat. Not to say you can't bring a lunch to work, but when you're driving around answering calls, it's nice to sit down and have a little downtime and eat something that you really do enjoy. And it looks like she took him to a barbecue spot and shared it with him. and he kind of recognized that was kind of a big deal for her to do that. And I know that I had some favorite spots around city, whether it was, getting some tacos or getting some Italian food, or a pizza. Those, everybody has those spots that they go to where, it's just, one of your favorites. And I'm sure you had some favorites too working. I mean, Orange County's a huge place, and then even Irvine too. There's probably some really good places to eat.
Yeah, I think what a lot of people don't, and I think they portrayed it in the show pretty well, but like you're not like off duty when you're eating, and you could get a call at any moment, and you have to like either just can your food or box it up and take it with you or whatever. So yeah, I was always looking for a place where like sitting down in a restaurant was really not something I did a whole lot. It was more like In and Out or something like that. It's not delicious, but not super healthy for you. And then I did sack, put a cooler in the car and bring food because that was always good. But yeah, early on, I learned a little trick for my TO, since this is about TOs and trainees, that I pass on to all my trainees, and then of course pass it on to my own children. But if you get burgers and fries, eat the fries first, because cold fries are horrible, but you can eat a cold burger. Right?
It's true. It's true.
So yeah, if you're somebody watching this and you're going to be going out on patrol, eat the fries first. Eat the fries first, and then get those down. And then if you get a call, you can put that burger next to you in the seat and you eat it later.
It's true. Yeah, you just can't crisp up a fry later. You can heat it up in a microwave, but it's never going to be the same. Coming out of the fryer.
Fries are the worst.
Oh yeah,
can't do that.
And so while they're sitting there talking about, they're just kind of hanging out and eating their food, Harmon makes a comment to Diaz when she sees him on the phone, and she thinks that he's talking to his girlfriend, like, "Hey, you're at work," and this is actually a pretty realistic little snippet there when they're showing the interaction of him being on the phone, because in reality, like you said before, there is no time off. I mean, when you're on and you're working and you're available to answer calls, even if you're getting something to eat, or even if you're going to the station to use the facilities, the bottom line is you could be asked to go and leave and respond to somewhere, depending on the seriousness of the event. And so, she's like, "Hey, you're working, you're being distracted right now. You need to pay attention to what you're doing." And maybe she was a little bit like, "Hey, I'm here. Why are you not talking to me? Why are you talking to the person on the phone?" And so, or maybe she was also saying it too because she knows that when you're working, you're busy, and it's an adjustment for somebody who's new to that kind of work environment. Like if you're not, whether it's a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a husband or a wife, they're not used to that. You can leave at a moment's notice, and it's like, "I got to go. I'll call you later." And that happens quite a bit. And so maybe she was just kind of giving him a little bit of a heads up, like, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, he's a trainee. I mean, when you're on training, you're not on your phone. You're not handling any other business except being on training. So yeah, unless it's an emergency, if I had a trainee, he's like, "Hey, I got to take this. This is my wife, and we have our kid's sick," or something. I mean, like, it was something like, I'm like, okay. But yeah, I mean, that's, and you want your trainee to be aware of what's going on around them and not being distracted and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's not something that would be typically okay to do.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And maybe in today's training environment, but generally speaking, when you're on training, you're 100% focused on, doing the job, paying attention, being aware. Doesn't, just because you're eating doesn't mean that you can start answering the phone and, calling somebody about a bill that you had to deal. You're working. You got to pay attention, especially when you're training, because you're in a learning environment.
I mean, I think what people Yeah, and I think what people don't understand who didn't have never done this, I mean, just imagine like when you're onboarding onto some company or something, and having your supervisor literally connected to your hip all the time. Like there's never really a moment that you're by
Hmm.
yourself, and they're constantly evaluating you, and every day they write up an evaluation on how you did that day, good and bad. So it's just it's a bit it is nerve wracking. It's nerve wracking. You're just that this person's like literally judging you at every moment, and you can't just shut down. Like you have to be ready, willing, on top of it, because you want that person to believe that you want your trainer to believe that you can do this, right? That
Hmm.
you can be a solo competent patrol
Hmm.
officer, and that's really what we're not making um, a patrol officer that knows how to do everything when they get out of
Right.
training. Just that you're competent and you can manage that patrol car by yourself and all the things that
Right.
happen in there.
Right. Yeah, and one of the things, and I think we've talked about it in a previous episode, is listening to the radio. Is that's one of those skills that you
Mm.
acquire during a training period. And if you're talking on the phone and you're learning how to listen to the radio and all the stuff that happens, if you're in a place that's busy and there's a lot of calls, you get really good at deciphering what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to, but you're always paying attention. And so when he's talking on the phone and he's brand new, there's no way he's listening to the radio and picking up important information
Yeah.
so that he can respond to it. Like, hey, there's a officer needs help down the street, or they're on a call and they need a backup, and we're 2 blocks away. Well, he's chatting with somebody on the telephone. So that
Yeah.
part is definitely not something that skill you don't acquire that right away. It takes some time to acquire that skill.
Yeah, and plus you need to be listening to what your partner's doing. Like you need to know what activity if your partner's on the radio saying I'm doing X, Y, and Z and this is my location, like you need to know that. So that if all of a sudden you hear a struggle on the radio and they can't put out anything, you're gonna need to jump in that car and go exactly where you're going. So yeah, you
Hmm.
really can't just check out. You really need to be paying attention the whole time.
Right, right. Well, so while they're sitting there eating their lunch, there's a discussion that basically evolves into he's not talking to his girlfriend, he's talking to Holt, and Holt was the officer that was stuck with the needle in the neck when they were searching the uh, camp, the homeless camp, and he ended up having to get tested, and it turned out that there was HIV negative, and that was because obviously when you're dealing with needles, you got to worry about HIV and hepatitis and other bloodborne pathogens. And so anytime that
Mhm.
happens, it's a big deal. Obviously, the medicines now are a lot farther along than they used to be, back in the 90s and early 2000s. But definitely getting tested and coming up negative was a relief for Holt, I'm sure. But even Diaz
Mhm.
commented that he's not doing well, and psychologically, and emotionally, the idea of this could happen again, maybe, or something worse could happen, or maybe the reality of the job kind of just hit him like a brick wall, and he's thinking, I don't know if maybe he's having some doubts. Maybe he's like, I don't know if I want to do this. Do I want to be in an environment where I could get stuck with a needle again, or I could get into a fight and get hurt? I think a little bit of this is a serious business and people do get hurt. And this needle could have had HIV, and then I would have had to deal with HIV for the rest of my life. And so maybe he's having some second thoughts, and that's what's causing him some emotional and psychological distress. So, it's definitely something that you kind of have to decide that could happen. Obviously, you take precautions, but nothing is 100%.
Yeah, and what happened to him was like something he couldn't control, right? This guy just flies out of the tent and uh, and attacks him. So, like to some degree, you have to just understand that there are things you can control, and things you can't control. You're driving down the street and somebody T-bones you, like
Hmm.
you can't necessarily control that stuff. So it's just the way it is. But yeah, I mean, you have to be okay with that. And if you're not okay with that, going forward, it's going to be really tough because you're just going to be constantly kind of freaked out all the time, and that's not going to work well.
Yeah, it's going to impact the way you do your job. You're going to be worried about every person that you put your hands on to conduct a search, or having to go into a place wondering what's behind the door. and it's going to be kind of
Hmm.
either slowing you down or causing you to doubt some of what you're doing or your actions, and that can be, that can even be more dangerous depending on how it's impacting you, for sure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So they get dispatched after they have that conversation. Right before they get dispatched, Diaz asks about Harmon's sister. So you get a little bit of info about that her sister was in law enforcement and that she sustained a career-ending injury during a pursuit. And you really don't get much more. She doesn't give much more. In reality, you're not going to see a trainee asking a whole lot of personal questions to their FTO unless the FTO volunteers it. Because I'm not here to learn about the FTO's personal life. I'm here to learn the job, and the FTO is there to teach me the job, and all the personal information about her and her life and her family isn't really part of the equation when I'm learning. But that creates for some interesting backstory, and we'll learn a little bit more about her sister too as the season moves forward.
Hmm.
So the next scene, they get dispatched to a dispute call. They roll up to a motel, and this motel is, it's one of those that are on a street corner in kind of the, urban area of the city. There's a lot of challenges around a hotel like this. They're usually single bedroom hotels where somebody would come in to stay a night or use it for a night or two, or some of them may even get assistance to use one of the hotels. And so when they show up, a female's pointing to the hotel room where there's apparently a loud argument. They respond to that hotel room, and when they respond to the room, they see a topless female and a naked male, and it looks like they've been arguing and possibly fighting. And the male is yelling out loud that he's been burned with something, and I think he's saying something about a pot. And so they go into and try to investigate. They have a moment there where trying to control both of them, and they end up Harmon ends up arresting both of them. And during the arrest and the discussion, the male, who goes by the name Creeper, says that he has some information. Yeah, Creeper says that he has some information on the East Barrio gang, and they're sitting on a package, is the way he words it. And so they end up separating them. The female gets taken out to one of the police cars out in the parking lot, and another unit shows up to assist with that. And then Harmon ends up making a phone call to steps away and makes a phone call. You don't really get any info on the phone call. That she's just kind of stepped off to the side after she got this info, and then she kind of comes back, and then she starts to do an interview of Liana, who was the female in the hotel room. And when she starts to interview her, she gets some information that there's another person, another female named Baby Blue, and she might have some more information on the package. And so she figures out where Baby Blue is at by talking to Liana, and that's obviously one of the scenes coming up. And there's a little follow-up to that. And so basically from this call, they ended up hitting the jackpot, basically. They end up showing up on a call that's a domestic deal. And then now, they're off going and chasing down a potential link to the murder of Delgado. And so they end up going to a donut place and locating this Baby Blue and start to interview her to gain some information about where Maniac may be, or some associates of Maniac. And honestly, that's
Yeah.
exactly how it would happen. I mean, you would just come across something if you're paying attention and you're asking questions. You learn stuff because you're curious. And next thing you know, you're pointing in the direction of the potential suspect of the murder of a police officer.
Yeah, it's exactly. And the domestic dispute, actually, I had a domestic dispute like this in a hotel, almost exactly the same. So I watching this, I'm like, oh my gosh, this totally reminds me. And it was, yeah, people heavily intoxicated. And actually they were their kids, and their kids were down in the lobby, and they had like kids that were like ranging from ages of like 8 to like 13. There was like 3 or 4 of them.
Mm-hmm.
And they went down to the lobby because mom and dad were fighting. And so then the lobby manager or the hotel manager in the lobby called us. So we went up there and they were knocked on the door, would not answer. We had a key, so we went in. And when you walk in, you're looking at like the living room area, and it was trashed. Like it looked like there was a fight. It looked like it was a drag out fight. Like even the lampshade was torn. It was, and we're calling out, and we got our guns drawn, and no one's answering. And so we couldn't work our way back to so like a living room, and there's like a bedroom in the back. We work our way back, open the door, pitch black in there, flashlights on, and they were in. I think they were making up. They were making up after the fight, is what they were doing. Yeah. So we had to have them come out, and they were both naked and super intoxicated, just out of their minds, intoxicated. And oh my gosh, I was just thinking like this is like a TV show. This is ridiculous. And I'm like, why are you guys so intoxicated? And you got your kids running around, and like, what is going on? So anyway, but yeah, I had a very similar call.
And so, she learns, that's the other thing is that, they're out there, they get some information. And Harmon doesn't immediately share this information with the task force. Obviously this is what the show is depicting. What's your take on the conduct of her not relaying any of this information to a task force that was created to find the murderer of Delgado or those associated with it?
Yeah, you would never do that. I mean, you would never not do that. In other words, she should absolutely have done that. But of course,
right.
she's on her own little crusade here, and it makes for a good story. But yeah, and she's kind of been iced out of it, right? Like the lieutenant at one point, I forget what episode it was, but basically said, "Hey, like we're leaving this up. You're not involved. We're leaving this up to the task force." So she's kind of been iced from the task force anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So in her mind, she's like, well, if I tell them, they're going to take it and they're not, and I'm out. So,
right.
Obviously that's their motivation, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how you do what she does and then you're not going to get disciplined for that.
Yeah. Cause that's a pretty big deal. I mean, you're talking about a pretty serious crime, and that's the reason they put up a task force, is to locate that suspect or suspects as immediately and ideally as safely as possible. And if they're not getting all the information available, they definitely can't, and they're going to bring resources to figuring out, where the person is or where the associates are. And to hold that back is, they're kind of hinting that, they did hint in the show that Harmon had an FTO relationship with Delgado and she had trained her. But usually you're trained by multiple FTOs. So there may have been 3 or 4 other FTOs that had also trained Delgado. And they all had an impact and influence on how she went out and did her job. And they all had an impact on passing her through that probationary FTO phase. So the fact that, they're always kind of hinting that she's got this personal investment. I mean, that could be true because she did train her. But to go run off and not share important information like that with a task force that's looking for the suspect is definitely something that you would not do. And like you said before, that would definitely come back. There'd be a lot of questions after that.
Oh, the task force people would be so mad. Like whoever's on that task force, like in their mind after that happened, they'd be like, Harmon, like any other interaction she's going to have with those people in that department is poisoned by her not doing that the right way. Like it's gonna be really bad. But you're right. I didn't even think about that. Of course, Delgado's gonna have 3 or 4 more training officers. You don't keep the same training officer all the way through all 4 phases or whatever it is. So yeah, I didn't even think of that. That's a good point, Omar. That was something they kind of left out of this, but who would know that except us?
Yeah, it's a missing piece there. You think that that Harmon had trained her the entire time, and that's just not the case. The idea of having multiple field training officers is to learn a little bit from everybody so that you can, take what works for you, take what you thought was helpful. Obviously, they're all teaching you different ways to do the job, but you can do the job in all those different ways. And then you create your own way of doing police work, learning all those different, methods and ways of doing it.
Yeah, it's actually a really valuable aspect to training because I had a TO who was like like a really great investigator, and he taught me a lot about investigations and what happens after you turn in your report, and had a guy who was like a SWAT guy, and so he had a lot of tactical stuff to share with me. So yeah, you really need to have that diversity of experience to help round you out as a good patrol officer.
Yeah, it definitely helps because you get, like if you have like you said, a tactical person or a SWAT person, somebody who was a detective, all those experiences help you be a better patrol officer. And then ultimately down the road, if you look to go to one of those different areas, you'd be able to have some conversations with somebody who was working in one of those details and to see if it's something you'd want to do or try to do.
Mm-hmm.
So moving on, scene 3, Harmon and Diaz arrive at the motel. So once they talk to the female over there at Angel Food Donuts, she gives them some information that some of her friends, girls, have been hanging out with some East Barrio players at a local hotel. And so that sends him off in the direction, Harmon and Diaz, to the hotel, where they kind of do a little bit of investigative work to determine, who's there. They see some information that indicates that some East Barrio players could be there. They run a license plate and see a car, and so they start to do some surveillance on their own before notifying the task force. And so at this point, they're thinking that there's some possibility that Maniac could be there, even though they haven't seen him, and they know that there's a potential East Barrio, they call heavy hitter, there with his car in the parking lot. She makes the conclusion that he is there, and so everything that follows after that is based on that conclusion without even positively identifying him, saying, hey, yeah, he is in the hotel. There is a possibility he's there, but she makes it like he is there, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And then at that point, she calls for backup. She tells Diaz, like, hey, are you in? Because we're going to go and, we're going to follow this through. And so she kind of puts it on him, like, do you want to be involved with this? Do you want to stay out of it? And that part there was a little bit like, hey, he's the training officer. He doesn't get to decide when he does. That's the FTO's job to decide what he's going to get involved with and what he doesn't get involved with. He's too early on in his career to be making those decisions. He's still learning the job. But she gives him this choice, like, hey, you get to decide on this one. And then that revolves around that whole don't trust Harmon sentiment that's kind of out there and that he's heard about from other people. And so then they end up waiting for backup to show up. Harmon believes Maniac is in there, even though there was no information to indicate that we got from the show. And once the officers, start to roll in, she ends up giving the update to Lasman, and he ends up basically saying, like, is he in there? And she's like, yeah, he's in there. Trust me, he's in there. But we've never seen him. And so then they go ahead and formulate a plan to go in there and search the room, see if he's in there and potentially make an arrest.
So are you saying, Omar, that that you wouldn't do that if you didn't have any confirmation that guy is in there, and you don't know how many people are in there, and you don't know how they're armed? Are you saying you wouldn't go in there like that?
Well, I would say there's a lot of ways to tackle that big question mark. And going in there with a line of police officers carrying guns might not be one of them. There's a whole bunch of ways to figure out if there are even East Barrio like in the series, if there's East Barrio people in there, and then if there's the suspect in there, and those ways don't necessarily require any, they don't require any uniformed police officers. All kinds of things you can do to figure that out. Bring in detectives, utilize the resources on the task force. Mm-hmm. Surveillance, additional surveillance.
I thought it was insane. I was like, maybe if there was an active shooter or something where they had to go in right now and like they're just gonna form up and just make entry or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm like, why? You don't know how many guys are in there. You don't know how they're armed. You don't know the layout. I'm like, why would you do this? Like, why wouldn't you get some plainclothes guys, have them, code 5 will surveil, right? Wait for these guys to get in their cars as they leave and then do some stops while you got these guys contained in vehicles. Like, yeah, like there's so many different ways where they could have just gotten, hosed by those guys. I thought that was insane.
Yeah. And, making the entry, that's one of those dangerous things. It's kind of like the pursuits we were talking about. Pursuit, number one, being dangerous, pursuit on the wrong side of the road being dangerous, and then making an entry into a motel room with a potential murder suspect of a law enforcement officer is really doesn't get much more dangerous than that. So you've got to utilize all your resources to do it as safely as you can once you've determined that suspect is in there.
Oh, it would be a total SWAT call out in that situation. It's totally time discretionary. There wasn't there wasn't a reason why they had to go in right away. There wasn't like they were gonna like teleport or something. Like they weren't going anywhere.
No.
They had them all in there. Like it doesn't make any sense that you would do that. You would.
It wouldn't. If they're in there, they're in there. You would obviously set up some kind of containment so they couldn't leave, and then you would take your time to figure out who's in there, and then to remove them safely as possible. And that a lot of times comes that a lot of times comes down to those that are inside. Like if they're like, hey man, I don't want to have any part of this, they'll just walk, they may just walk right out and say, I don't want to have any part of this, or I don't know who those people are. I just stopped by to visit, I'm coming out, kind of a thing. And so it can be a lot easier than some might think.
Well, and then you got Sergeant Lasman there on the scene, right? Right. He was in that stack, right? Yeah. So it's on him. Like you show up as a sergeant, and they're like, "Hey, Sarge, this is what we're gonna do. We're all just gonna like line up, and we're just gonna like go in there, and and probably into a shooting. Like, what do you think? And he'd be like, No, we're not here. We're not all gonna die tonight. Like, we're not gonna do that. So
it was a little Wild West.
Tools, we got time.
Yeah, it was a little Wild West there going up. Little old Wild West movie there. Hey, we're gonna just go there and storm them.
So Sergeant Lasman is not killing it as a supervisor.
No, I mean, and that's his job. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Like, he says, okay, well, she says to Harmon, I'm going to trust you. And like, no, his job is to be that next rung and figure out if this is the best way for all the reasons, for safety, for the investigation. And then, does the task force know about this info and let the task force be the lead on? I mean, there's all kinds of things that he's supposed to be doing that he didn't do. He just said, let's go get them. And they storm the castle.
If they go in there, they go in there and they all get murdered or they shoot somebody by accident, like whatever. Like, he's not going to point at Harmon. He's like, this is her idea. Like, no, you're Sergeant Lasman. You're the sergeant. Like, no, this is 1,000,000% your call. So you blew it.
Yeah. And that's
Sergeant
what his
Lasman's
job is.
Fired.
He's going to be, I don't know what's going to happen with him, but definitely he wasn't doing, you might as well just demote him and make him an officer because he was acting like an officer. It's like he wasn't supervising. His job is to supervise.
No, he wasn't.
Yeah.
He was not supervising.
So there's a scene there at the end of that where they actually make entry and they end up getting into a shooting inside the motel, and the suspect flees out through a window and down the alley, and Harmon pursues on foot. And they're running down the alley, and she's putting some information out over the radio. And then they end up, and I think it was an abandoned Walmart, is what I think they said in the series. But they end up, she's by herself chasing a murder suspect on foot. Doesn't know if he's armed or not, and they end up in this abandoned warehouse, and she's alone, and they end up getting into a scuffle. There's a fight over her gun, and when they get into that fight, it doesn't look like Harmon is winning. She can't get to her gun. The suspect is about to choke the life out of her after he had hit her a couple of times. And it wasn't until Harmon retrieved her backup gun and used her backup gun to control the situation. And there was a moment there that they talk about later in the episode where she ends up taking the gun out and saying, basically, we're done fighting, and puts the gun up to his forehead. And then that's when Lasman shows up, and there's a moment there where she could have shot him. She looks over and she sees that her body cam is on the ground away from her. So it's kind of like, do I shoot him? Do I not shoot him? The camera's not here. And then Lasman shows up and then helps, arrest him, take him into custody. And so that's how that scene ends, of her lying on the floor inside that abandoned Walmart, and getting real close to being killed herself, after that foot pursuit.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought, again, she's a foot pursuit by yourself. I feel like we've established in the previous episodes you're not supposed to do that. And then, but maybe you're like, okay, this guy's a murderer. It's worth the risk. I don't know. She goes after. I did feel like, though, that they were realistic in terms of, in that fight, she's going to lose.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's just like you see a lot of shows where the female lead is like a kung fu expert and she's taking dudes out, and that's just not how it works. That's not how fights are. Fights are really, they're a struggle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Usually to the ground, and the person in that situation, the stronger person's going to win.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that's why we have lots of tools as a police officer, whether it's a gun, baton, knife, pepper spray, taser, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Because yes, there's always someone stronger. But female officer in that situation against, a fighting age man, you're going to lose that fight. And I felt like they did a good job of showing how kind of perilous things were for her, and that she had that backup piece, and that worked out well for her, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, that's why you have a backup gun. I mean, right there.
Yeah, that's definitely one of them. The other is if your primary firearm fails or something happens to it and it jams, you've got a second firearm. But yeah, and the part of it is she ended up putting herself in a situation where she had fewer options to, we could say, win. At least winning is taking that person into custody. And by her running off by herself, all the available tools for her and the resources available to take that person into custody safely, or if it resulted in a shooting, at least, the cards would have been on her side, instead of putting herself in a situation where it was just one against one. And like you said, you've got, a young male adult who had the physical strength to overcome her and was able to. It wasn't looking good for her up until she ended up retrieving her backup gun, and then Lasman showed up. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of ways she could have, kept that situation from being the way it was inside that abandoned Walmart by herself. But, that's another long conversation about, how she ended up there. But, the reality is she still ended up using what resources she had to survive. And then, of course, the show put in that dilemma, like a moral, ethical dilemma with the camera. And this is the guy that ended up shooting Delgado and killing her. And, she had the gun to his head. Like, what do I do? And am I am I authorized deadly force? Am I shoot him? What's, all these things you could come up with about if she shoots him, if she doesn't shoot him. Who knows what she was thinking, because she was just looking at him. But there was a pause there that something was going on in her head about whether or not she was going to.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, I liked that, and it definitely makes her character. She's kind of the ideal, right? That passionate, but at the same time,
mm-hmm.
but also like willing to. She's not going to step over that line. So I thought that was a good
Mm-hmm.
job, with regards to her character.
Yeah, I mean, I will say, if you're looking back, at least from the previous episodes, she was kind of playing the typical cynical cop, where she had Diaz pulling over the
Mm-hmm.
guy with the drug pipe, and she's like, "Oh, he'll learn eventually that you can't fix everything." And you've got Sergeant Lasman, who's like, "Hey, you got to hammer down, you got to arrest people, and you got to if they put their hands on you or try to harm you, you got to go after and get them." And in this moment here, it's almost like, is she going to be, if you're going to compare the two, is she going to be a Lasman? Is she going to behave like a Sergeant Lasman, or is she going to behave like the idealistic Diaz? And so she's in the middle.
Mm.
Interesting contrast. I don't know if they planned it that way, but it looked like Lasman on one side and Diaz on the other. And where is she going to fall? And she looks over and she sees her body cam on the ground, not anywhere near her. And she decides, basically to take him into custody. And then we're going to hear later why she, what her process was about doing that. Who was she going to honor in doing that?
Well, I think Omar, I think that's really insightful. I don't know if they meant to do that. If they didn't, they should have, because it's really kind of, yeah, it's really the dichotomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're right. Lasman is, we're going old school, and it's almost like that scene in the Untouchables. They put one of yours in the hospital, you put one of theirs in the morgue, kind of
Right.
mentality, and then you have Diaz, who's like this, you know, pure soul that is he gonna get corrupted?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I wonder if Lasman was in that situation, would have Lasman shot him? I don't know, but definitely like that's the tension, right? And she just kind of straddled that and then figured it out, so that was cool.
Right. And I think if you just take that small example and you were to actually send it out, like, I don't know, send it out into the world, when you're talking about like conflicts, international conflicts and things going on around the world, it's, how does a country behave? Are they more like Diaz? Are they going to be more down the middle? Are they going to be more like Lasman, which is the old school, kind of the head knocker, using force when force can be used and not using it lightly, kind of a thing. So, there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot to it. Like I said, I don't know if they planned any of that, but that's what I thought of when I saw that kind of scene there. And she's kind of looking back and forth. It's like she's jogging between the two people. Like, who am I going to be today? I think she already knew who she was,
Yeah.
but So scene 4.
Omar, you're just taking this to another level. Like you're finding layers. Like I love this. It's so good.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, that's what we're
I
doing.
love it. All right.
We're giving
Yeah.
the realistic the realistic
Uh huh.
perspective, and then we're adding in a few layers. Who knows if the writers actually were
Yeah.
thinking of all that stuff? I don't know, but maybe they'll have
Uh,
some
yeah.
extra. Yeah,
We're critiquing art.
it's art.
this is a art form, and we're critiquing it.
Yeah,
And like
that's
what?
it.
Yeah, we should do that.
And we're
All right.
intertwining
So
law
what
enforcement.
happened?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
scene
we got a
4.
couple of Leos
Yep,
breaking down the artistic under the metaphor of that scene. That's
that's it.
fantastic.
There you go. It's like a college
Um,
class at the same time.
it is.
So, scene 4 begins with a bird's eye view of the motel. It's filled with police vehicles. Harmon is speaking to the female outside that was probably inside one of the hotel rooms, telling her everything's going to be okay. She's going to meet her at the hospital. And then she ends up talking to Detective Koyama, who was her FTO when she was in training, and he's just checking on her and making sure that she's okay after this, officer involved shooting, the incident in the Walmart, the abandoned Walmart building, and just kind of checking in on her, kind of gives her a hug, and he's given her some information to, like, hey, it looks like the shooting is good. Looks like everything is the way it should be as far as, you doing all the things you were supposed to, as far as the shooting was concerned. And he reassures her, out in the parking lot. And there's obviously the investigation, and they kind of hint a little bit about going, because there's going to be an investigation when you get a shooting like that. It's going to be a long drawn out process. They're going to be out there for a while.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a pretty traumatic night for Harmon. Like, I mean, she shoots a guy. Obviously that guy was deceased, and then gets into a foot pursuit, and then fights for her life and almost dies.
Yeah.
Like, either one of those would have been enough, but she did all those things, and so obviously someone like that, someone needs to check with her.
Yeah. You're going to get that. That reassurance is a big deal because, everyone's probably going to have a little bit of doubt about what they did and how they did it. If it's a shooting or serious use of force or somebody gets injured, you're immediately going to start, running through your mind and kind of maybe not second guessing, but evaluating what you did. You're like, is this the best way that I could have done it? Even though it turned out not so good or not the way that I would have wanted it to be. Is this, the best way to accomplish what we were looking to accomplish in their case, which was to go in there and arrest Maniac. And we've already talked a little bit about that. There are other ways to do that, but they ended up deciding to take a whole group of officers in there.
Yeah. I don't think you know this about me, Omar, but I was involved in a officer involved shooting.
Oh, I don't.
And in my first year as a police officer, and so I can tell you that the whole post shooting thing was very different in real life than it was in the TV show. But yeah, it's the shooting happened probably like 2:00 in the morning, and I don't think I got home until like 7 or 8 o'clock. Later, because they take you. The sergeant asks you a couple of safety questions like, were there any outstanding suspects? What direction did you shoot? How many bullets did you shoot? Like, so they just want to make sure that if there's a bullet kept traveling, they want to know where they all impacted. And then, so then you're sitting at the station waiting and waiting and waiting, and finally, at least down here in Orange County, they have the DA's office has an investigative team. That's all they do. Well, it's one of the things that they do, but they do the independent shooting investigation. And so then, of course, your lawyer shows up from the association president, got woken up that night, showed up at the station, talked to me. My lawyer was there. We talked, got interviewed by the shooting team. And, and then finally you go home. But, in this, you're not walking out of the station, with everybody like you're getting off duty. It's not like that at all.
Yeah, I would say that's one of the things that you don't really see in the series because it's just not interesting to show, is that you spend a lot of time writing reports and they spend like no time writing reports. I think the most I've seen them write maybe is on an FI card. But you can right. I'm sure you can speak to this, that, just the impact of being in that kind of critical incident. I mean, it physiologically, just getting into something serious, but getting into which, some would say getting into an officer involved shooting or a deputy involved shooting is one of the most serious things that you can do as a law enforcement officer, and you'd be able to speak to it, is that it comes with all kinds of, your feeling about different things and your thought about, the call, and, you're running it all through your head. And then of course, all the procedures and processes you got to go through when you're reporting it, and the department is investigating it, is it can be a challenging and exhausting and stressful event.
It's incredibly stressful. Yeah, super stressful because, you know, like, yeah, because the department's doing their own kind of parallel, you know, internal investigation of the whole thing, and there's, for me, I think we knew right away that it was a good shooting. Like that wasn't a question, which is obviously good. You wouldn't want to be going home that night and wondering like what's going to happen. But and you get you get 3 days off, like whether you like it or not. You get
Mm-hmm.
3 paid days off. And but it was, I mean, they take your gun. They took my gun and immediately replaced it with a new gun. So that wasn't like I did anything wrong. You know what I mean? So I like they do that now. I think back in the day they would just take your gun,
Yeah,
but
leave you with nothing.
they do ballistics, leave you with nothing. And yeah, so I mean, it was, I really appreciated the people in the department that I knew that would were calling me and saying how you doing, and and I'd only been there about a year, so it wasn't like I knew a lot of people really in a way, and yeah, so it was a not a traumatic experience, but it was an experience. It was stressful, and you know, I got to say that I've always been very lucky in the sense that maybe just the way I'm wired, like it's not something that when things happen at work, I never brought them home. Like I really
Mm-hmm.
was able to kind of compartmentalize
Mm-hmm.
those experiences that I had at work, and then I never really talked to my wife about it because all the stories are kind of gross or sad, so we don't talk about it too much. But yeah, I mean, it was I went through the whole thing, and then you end up you have to meet actually I didn't meet one on one with a psychologist. They brought in a psychologist, and then they actually did a group meeting with me and the other people who were involved in the incident. And we just kind of talked about it, which was actually really good. Because you kind of hear what other people or what they thought, what they saw, and how they felt about it, and
Mm-hmm.
one of the only maybe the only thing I remember about that was that the psychologist he works with police all the time. He says you don't have to feel bad about this. He's like, you did your job. You did what you were supposed to do, what you're being paid to do. You did it in the right way. You used deadly force when you had to, because if you didn't, you or one of your partners wouldn't be here. And he goes, so you don't have to feel bad about that. He goes, in fact,
Mm-hmm.
you should feel good about it.
Right.
And it was like kind of giving you permission to not lament it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you did a thing that most people will never have to experience, never want to experience. Like basically you're doing something that potentially would take the life of another human being. Now, the person I shot, he did survive. He went to prison for multiple attempt murder on police officers. But yeah, I mean, like, I remember walking away from that. I'm like, yeah, I feel like I protected myself, I protected my partners, and I don't feel bad about it.
Yeah. I think it's important. I think that's what they're giving you here with Detective Koyama is that he's given her some of that reassurance. And at that moment,
Hmm.
she may have needed it. Maybe she didn't need it, but he was smart enough to know. And whether or not it was an honest opinion, he said, "Look, whatever I've seen so far, it looks like this is a good deal, a good shoot, a good incident as far as using force, deadly force." And that can go a long way in how somebody processes the rest of the event, and not having them worry about it all night, not having them be able to sleep at night, reliving the incident in their head over and over again, wondering if they did the right thing. And so that alone,
Hmm.
that short conversation could have helped her kind of move past that, like it sounded like it did for you, saying, "Hey, you're out here, you were doing your job," you know.
Hmm. Yeah, I feel
So
like in a department, uh, I think a department should pray. Like usually they do. Like usually you get an award or something, like with Medal of Valor or something in those situations,
mm,
and you should, like, people who do that, who do that the hard job, correctly, like I think the department should recognize that and praise those individuals. And I just feel like in some instances, like our society in general, I think just sees that as a bad thing. Like
Right.
you had to use the force. It's bad, but yeah, I think
Right.
in that context, it's actually something that should be praised. The
Ye-
people who are willing to risk their life to protect others, and they do the most difficult thing. I think that should be recognized.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is what you're alluding to, but I'm definitely, when an officer gets into a shooting, they're doing something, you know, extremely stressful. It's going to come with all kinds of legal issues, investigations, and they did it for the reasons like you're talking about, to protect life, to keep somebody safe,
Mm-hmm.
that rose to the level of deadly force. And there's no award for that. I mean, it's almost kind of, they shy, do agencies and departments, law enforcement agencies shy away from it because they don't want to give you an award for shooting somebody. Like that's the way it's going to be framed. So,
The optics are a little weird. Yeah.
yeah. So you shot somebody. We don't care about the reasons. We were just saying you shot somebody and we're going to give you an award for that. It wasn't like, you went in to rescue a female inside of a house that had been shot by her father, and you went in to go to get her to rescue her because you knew if you didn't that she could eventually bleed out, and die. You end up going in to get her and to take her out to safety. You'll get an award for that because you didn't shoot anybody. But let's say on the way in, you end up trying to rescue her. You do get into a shooting. It's kind of like one of those things where, okay, well, we can give an award for that because, you had to go save somebody versus you just running after a bad guy who was going to potentially kill somebody or hurt somebody, and you shot them. Well, I don't know if we're going to give you an award for that because you ended up just shooting them and it doesn't look great.
Yeah.
I don't know.
And you no, like yeah, the guy was just merely trying to escape. And he points a gun at you, and you shoot him because of that. Somebody say like, well, if you hadn't chased him, you would never had a pointing gun at you, and therefore you would never have to shoot him. And I think there are people who think that, who actually say those things, and at the same time, like if you're working for a department and you want to know, hey, if I'm risking my life tonight, I'm going out to patrol, and I'm risking my life, I need to know, I want to know, does this department, are they gonna, if I do the right thing, right, are they gonna back me? Do they appreciate me? And I think that means something. Like I think that's what that's what the department signals to everyone else, that either they understand the sacrifice, like the toll, like you're saying, like the stress, the mental health potential toll. And I feel like if they did that, there might be less mental health toll. Like I think if you were like, okay, the department's like, we appreciate what you did. This is hard, and you're gonna have to. There's some your own personal consequences, the stress and everything, for doing the right thing. Like, and we appreciate you for doing that. Like, I think a department should somehow convey that,
Right.
because that, I think everybody else who sees it happening is saying, okay, like,
Yeah.
the hardest thing is to do this, and we have a department that's willing to support us if we do. So.
I think you're really talking about what's kind of going on today. There's this, if you look back at least the last 5 years or so, the sentiment towards law enforcement has, it's been negative. There's a lot of negativity out there. You got the First Amendment folks going around and challenging officers to see if they know what the law is and understanding what somebody's rights are. And while some may view it as, I'm just exercising my First Amendment rights, some could look at it like they're, it's another attack on law enforcement. It's another negative, focus. It's not like, hey, let's sit down and have a conversation about it. It's, I'm going to create this conflict, and this conflict is going to tell me whether or not you know the law. And then I'm going to go around all over the country and create conflict to see if, you know what you're doing as a law enforcement officer. And then I think, when you're talking about law enforcement in general and you're talking about recruiting, I don't think it's a surprise why a lot of agencies are having a hard time trying to recruit, because people are smart. They're looking at like, let's see, I can go be a law enforcement officer and I got people yelling at me. And then if I do my job and I go out and I have to use force or I have to get into a shooting, it's like a roll of the Vegas dice, whether or not I'm going to be backed up by somebody. And it's just going to be me. It's going to be me and the union, and I'm all on my own. And I may not be backed by my agency. And so I think potential candidates for doing the job are looking at it like, I don't know if I want to do this. Yeah, it pays okay in some places, but is all that stress and all that, negativity worth me spending my life doing? And I'm not saying it for me. I'm just saying it for those that were thinking about maybe getting into the profession, and that's a huge hurdle.
That's the question. It's a huge hurdle. Yeah. And you're right. I think, now I gotta say, like, when I was the last part of my career as a sergeant in the jail, and that's where the brand new people who get out of, the academy, they go first. And I just had one after another, really great young people, in their early 20s coming in, and working for the sheriff's department. And I was like, you know what? Thank goodness we still have good people that are, really amazing people, smart, conscientious, empathetic, but like at the same time, they'll get down and if somebody wants to square off, they're going to fight, right? Like, they're not afraid. So it's kind of the perfect kind of combination of the human being that you want doing that. And we had those people, and I'm like, thank God there's still people willing to do this job, because on paper it doesn't look great. I mean, in terms of, or on the news, it doesn't look great. And I think God bless the people who are still doing this job after you and I left it.
Right.
Because I think recruiting is tough. I don't think you're getting as many people as we used to. We're still getting good people, but yeah, it's you really need a special soul to a person to do this job, and it's so complicated now. It's not like, you're not just doing one thing. You're a social worker, you're a mental health person, you're all the things. So
you're a movie star now too. You're on camera all the time. I mean, when I first got on, you're a movie star, and you don't want to be a movie star. You don't want to be in Hollywood, but now you're walking around with a camera and it's filming you do everything just about. And so now you're this, you're a reluctant movie star in this, 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. And most actors don't even get filmed that much. And you're getting filmed more than some people in Hollywood that are doing, movies every couple of years. It's a whole new world. Yeah, the scrutiny is off the chart compared to what it used to be. And then you add on, like I mentioned before, all what could be perceived as negativity, with the First Amendment folks challenging officers, and just the general sentiment about law enforcement that's been out there about, being abusing their power and not doing, what they should be doing, which is, obviously a conversation. And that's really what it should be. It should be that conversation about, getting it out to those folks so they understand what the job is as best you can. I know when I was in training and we would do courses for the community, and we would do, these would be like 50 people, maybe 75 people, depending on the size of the course. And when we would teach designated courses for the group, their sentiment after the course would be, they would say, oh, I never thought of it that way. It never occurred to me that those were all the things going on when we would run them through a scenario. And so as a result, they left with a whole different kind of, mindset and frame of reference when it came to doing law enforcement, and they didn't have before. But we're only talking about 50 to 75 people. We're not talking about, the rest of the world or the rest of the nation. And that's a huge kind of, most people are like, I don't want to know about it. I don't, like maybe those listening here, they're interested, but a lot of people aren't interested until something impacts them. And then when it impacts them, they'll have an interest. So, I get that. But at the same time, that information out there, when you look at a 2-second video or 30-second video and you make an assessment on it, and you don't have all the information or all the facts, okay, well, that can be a challenging way to go and evaluate what law enforcement is actually doing and if they're doing a good job.
Absolutely.
Give me one sec. All right. Okay. All right. Moving on. Oop. All right, moving on.
Okay.
So scene 5 is you got the next scene. It's you got Lieutenant Bishop walks into the locker room to speak with Harmon after the incident at the motel and acknowledging, that it was a tough night. And so Bishop is coming in to ask Harmon, hey, look, I need to know like how you found out that Maniac was at the hotel and how you located him, because basically the task force is going to have questions and I want to be able to give them what they need. And so that's kind of where this, I need to be able to tell the brass how we ended up there, kind of a thing. And so she wanted to get it straight from Harmon. And so they start to have this discussion. So you're wondering, Bishop's kind of coming into the locker room to have this conversation while she's, changing to leave. And so you're, for me, I'm wondering like, what are her motives here? Because like I said before, one of the things they're not doing is they don't really show you anybody writing a report. She's going to have to write a report for this whole thing. And that report is going to have the facts in it.
Nope. Nope. When you're in a shooting, no report.
Oh, okay. Well, you guys didn't write reports. We would write reports.
No. If you're the person who pulls the trigger, you do not write anything. Someone else is going to write a report, but you're not doing it.
Oh, okay. Okay. So,
no, and I think it's the liability, and you're under investigation of it. And all that. So you don't write anything.
Yeah, right. For sure, her being in the shooting. And now I don't know. Back in the day, it used to be like direct dictation. You would say if you were going to write something, you could either, because it wasn't. The computers evolved over time. And, I don't know how the process goes. Like you said, when a supervisor shows up, they're going to say, hey, how many rounds you shoot, what direction, so they can do those safety checks and all that sort of thing. But when you're, there was a time where some agencies where you would show up, you were involved in a shooting, and you wouldn't say anything. And so then if there was no information at all given to the investigators, then they can't start to piece together whether or not this was a legal shooting or an illegal shooting. And so there had to be some kind of information given so that they could say, okay, I'm not going to treat you as a suspect because I know enough about the shooting to, say what happened here. And I can make a determination that it was, it fell within policy and it fell within, the appropriate legal standards, or that it didn't. But if you say nothing, then they won't have those facts. And it depends on how they get them, I guess, is part of it.
Yeah, I mean, because you immediately trigger an IA investigation, so they're going to have to. You have to be compelled to tell them. Like they basically, like, in an IA investigation, and this is probably something regular people don't know, is that they have to order you to disclose information. In other words, you waive your Fifth Amendment right. So whatever you tell them, they cannot use in a criminal investigation against you because you're being compelled. You're basically giving up your Fifth Amendment right. If you don't tell them, which you of course you could, you're like, I'm not going to say anything. Then they're going to fire you for not complying. So yeah, so basically writing that report is kind of like, they'll. I mean, I guess in that situation, because there was so much that built up to that shooting, it is kind of interesting. I wonder, because like, what would she like write a memo or something, or I mean, she could just verbally tell her lieutenant like she did, but like you would have to. because there's gonna be you know, there's gonna be a prosecution of all the people in there, and so like you need to explain legally how you got into that apartment building
Right,
or that
right,
that motel.
right. Yeah,
So she's got to disclose all the who the confidential informant was, you know, like was it, you know, like it's actually how this whole thing would actually play out in real life would be really messy because uh you know, what would be their legal justification for breaking into that building,
yeah, and they would have
into
to
the
into the
there was no
motel.
exigency, was there?
No, in fact, like I mentioned before, she didn't even know he was in there with
No.
100% certainty. I mean, I don't even know she
Even,
had an
even it,
idea, but wasn't it
yeah, even if
wasn't
she knew 100%, just because there's a fugitive inside doesn't give you legal standing to just break in the door, because essentially, like, it's kind of like his home, right?
yeah,
And
no
you'd have
warrant.
to you just get an arrest warrant. You get an arrest warrant for that location for that person,
Yeah, and then she'd have to show that
and
he's
then
there. And she
they should have to
even
explain how she knows he's there. Yeah,
yeah. So I mean, yeah, there. I mean, that whole part of it is definitely would need. You know, she was going off a strong hunch, but that's you don't when you're investigating a murder, you're not doing a lot of hunching. I mean, you might use a hunch to gather more information and evidence, but you're not using that to go and knock down a door to a motel and make entry with eight police officers to go there and look for somebody that you're not even sure is there. Yeah.
yeah. If the result ends with people getting shot and losing their life, then you know that family's going to sue the department for sure, and then they're going to have to unwind this thing all the way back. And it's like, do you have a legal right to even enter that building
Right.
or that structure? Like,
Yeah.
I don't know how you know how you explain that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, again, that's you know, it's police work, but you know, this is a TV show.
Yeah, and I will say when it comes to shootings too, every agency handles those kinds of incidents different. I know that what you were talking about, how maybe Orange County handled them. Long Beach didn't; they would not handle them the same way. There was always back and forth about. There was a time where they included IA and then they didn't include IA, and so because when you include IA, then you immediately the officer then says, well, I'm not, I don't have to say anything until they order you to say something. And so there's all those
Yeah.
dynamics involved. And then for a little while too, we had a DA coming out and then we didn't have a DA coming out. I know that, when I was involved with assisting other agencies like LAPD, and I think this might have been the time when they were under consent decree, they had teams of detective coming out for different things. Like there was a use of force team, there was a shooting team. There were different teams that would come out to investigate their officer-involved shootings. So it was, and that was much different than us. We didn't have a use of force team and a shooting team. We just had our detectives were homicide detectives, and they would handle the shooting. They weren't a special team, but Long Beach isn't the size of LAPD either, so that could have been part of it. And the consent decree, I think they were under consent decree at the time, as another factor about why they were doing things the way they were doing them. So
Yep.
she basically goes in there and says, hey, I'm looking for some info. I need to relay it. And that moves us to the last scene where officers are leaving the station and Lasman tells everybody, hey, we're going over to the local bar to have a drink and a few beers, and asking Harmon to join them. So they can not really celebrate, but I'd say really kind of decompress the day. It's been a stressful shift, obviously a lot going on. And so they're all going to go over there and decompress after a challenging shift. And when she's walking out, Lasman walks up to Harmon, and it's just Harmon and him. And he asks her about taking that shot with the backup gun when she had it to the suspect's head. And Harmon pauses and says, no, I wanted to do right by Delgado. So like I had mentioned before, she was like, is she Lasman? Is she Diaz? Where does she fall in this? And she decided that she was going to honor Delgado's memory by going through the system and doing what, you know, she would have done if she's making an arrest and taking him into custody. And so, she tells that, and Lasman walks off. And then when Harmon walks over to her car, Diaz is waiting there for him. And they have a conversation about, hey, why don't you come over? Let's go to the bar, get a drink. And Harmon doesn't want to. And then you say, I'm just going to, I'm going home. She sits in the car. And while she's sitting there, she's looking at the funeral card for Delgado. And I think I think everything's starting to sink in for her about the day and Delgado and finding the suspect and having him arrested. And she's having like a moment there, instead of going to the bar and drinking with everybody and kind of decompressing. So that's how that last scene wraps up.
Yeah.
So did officers and deputies have a place to go after a shift? Most do, but, a place to go and decompress after a long shift.
Yeah. I didn't really do too much of that, actually. I had a family at home, so I was like, I'm going home now to my family. But yeah, I mean, there were I remember there was one shift where we just had a really good group of people, and we did do that a handful of times during the shift, and then always at the end of shift, before shift change, we usually have a little get together or something with everybody, because if everybody's going to a different shift, then it's just kind of a way to get
like
together with everybody, because you may not see them again for their 6 months or something.
Yeah, like an end of the year, end of the watch kind of party. Like if you had, we would, depending on how the agency is, most deployments in Long Beach were a year. They tried 6 months for a little while, but it was a lot of work to like reshuffle everybody after 6 months. So they just kept it at a year, and I'm pretty certain it's still the same. So when you're doing your patrol shifts, you're bidding for your patrol shifts, it lasts a year. So at the end of that year, everybody would go out and, kind of celebrate that year, because then, you do get people moving to different shifts in different parts of the city and different divisions. But for me too, I wasn't there were times I did go out, but it wasn't like I was a regular. I definitely wasn't a regular. And, obviously it can be expensive too when you're going out all the time to, have a drink. Unless you got something else to do with some of the money you're making, I guess. It's definitely, but some would decompress after work depending on the shift. And there would be a few bars in the city that were, kind of popular with police officers. And I'm sure every agency has. There was a time, I think there was a city where you could actually go to the Union, and the Union had a bar in their building. It wasn't in Long Beach. This was in another city. And of course, what happens when you bring people together, there's always some problems when there's bringing people together and everybody's drinking. And so I think they nixed that idea. Say, hey, people got to go to their own public bar kind of a thing. So when you're talking about, we've kind of already talked about this, but when you're talking about Lasman coming up to Harmon, what do you think I'm kind of curious to what his motivation was in asking Harmon about her decision to shoot or not shoot, because he knows she didn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, I don't know. I don't know if he's saying that I would have been okay if you had. I don't know if that was what it was about, but it obviously gives her the opportunity to talk about Delgado and starting with the memorial with her at the beginning of the episode, and kind of the bookend is, she wanted to do right by her. So I thought it was a nice kind of bookend to the show. But yeah, I don't know. I guess my gut is kind of based on Lasman's character up to this point. I think he probably would have been okay if she shot him. I don't think he would have. I mean, he'd be like, okay, I get it.
Yeah.
but obviously, not like executing him per se, but like she's in a fight, and
Right, right.
I don't know,
Yeah, I
but
think
yeah, I think that's what he was getting at.
yeah, I so I mean I was wondering like why would he come up to I mean he knows what she did, but why what's he looking for? Like why is he asking that question? And I know we're going to find out later for those that haven't watched the rest of the episodes or the episode after this, we're going to learn some more information about Lasman, and we're going to learn some more information about Harmon and kind of what happened with that whole relationship prior to the show, kind of prior to the beginning of the show.
Mm-hmm.
And part of me thought, the reason he's asking, and this is just kind of just, when it was happening, is that why would he be asking her? And I thought maybe he, because when you learn about what happens later, and I know what that is because I've already seen that episode. Some may have not seen it, but it's like he wants to know, like, does she have the capability to be like an old school police officer? Like, does she know, like, his way of doing police work and handling business and going out there and doing it his way? Is it even possible for her to even be that way? Or was she ever that way, kind of a thing? Like, could she ever be like me when I would go out? Could I sit in a car next to her and do police work with her? It was kind of like he was deciding whether or not, I know she ended up not shooting Maniac, but why, why would he be asking her if she didn't? It's like, well, maybe there's part of her that is like me, even though all that stuff that happened, because there would be no point to asking. Like, she's not like me. I know why she did it. I know why she didn't shoot him. I don't need to know the answer, but I'm going to ask because I think there's a little bit of her that is like me. And I just want to see if she's going to admit it. You know what I mean? And, she didn't answer the way that he wanted to answer. So he's like, oh, well, maybe there still is, but she's telling me there wasn't, and she wouldn't have, and she was going to arrest him and not shoot him. So, and then obviously that becomes a little more clear later when we see the following episode where she talks about, the whole investigation, and Lasman is involved with that and all that other stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was a good episode. Obviously, there was a lot
Yeah.
going on, and major stuff, right?
Yeah.
With Harmon in the shooting and Delgado's being laid to rest. So yeah, there was a lot happening in this one little 30-minute episode.
Yeah. A lot of undertones of things, undercurrent kind of, you don't have it all, the info yet. We're going to get more later. It's going to kind of bring stuff, to make it a little bit more clear. So, and then definitely some action with the whole hotel scene for sure. They put in some action there and made it a bit more exciting. But yeah, it didn't seem like it was going to be kind of started off, like the funeral and all that, but there was a lot going on, like you mentioned. So, hey, that concludes episode 4 on call. And so hopefully everybody enjoyed it. I know I enjoyed talking about it with you, Clay, and we've got more coming everyone's way, episode 5. So we're looking forward to
Next
that.
week.
Yep, next week.
Yeah, you can if you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. And we also have this podcast on the other podcast platforms like Apple Podcasts as well as other ones. So yeah, look for us on your favorite podcast platform, and we love your comments in the YouTube channel. So we'll see you guys next week.
Next week. Till next week.
Yep. Thanks, Omar.
See ya. Thanks.
See you, buddy.
See ya. All right.